Masechet Ketubot Daf Kof Vav. We began the Perek talking about the judges in Yerushalayim and how they would be paid from Tirumat Halishka, from the collection of Machasit HaShekel from the Bet HaMikdash. And because these judges were paid by communal funds, then they could remain objective, and that's much better than being paid by the litigants. By one litigant, certainly that would be totally a bribe, but even by both litigants is still not the best idea. And so now that we've spoken about this job of being a judge should be paid by communal funds, we're going to mention a few other jobs that were for holy purpose, higher goals, that also would be paid for by communal funds from the Bet HaMikdash. But first, we're just going to go back to one pasuk that we quoted regarding a man who brought a basket of fish to a rabbi, and he called it bikurim. And why did he call it bikurim? Because after all, remember that man who came to Elisha and he brought lechem bikurim, esrim lechem seorim v'charmel besiklono. He brought some bread. It calls it of bikurim, even though Elisha was not a kohen, and so the word bikurim here is not official bikurim, but a gift that one brings to an important person can still be called bikurim, and that was made up of 20 loaves and also fresh ears of corn. And these words lechem bikurim itself is, we're going to see in a second, is another item. So the 20 plus this one here and the one after is 22 items altogether. Since we quoted this pasuk, we're going to bring another agadah that also mentions this pasuk. So that's what we begin with. Bishne de Rav Yosef hava ritcha. In the years of Rav Yosef, God was angry. People did some sin. Amri le Rabbanan le Rav Yosef, and God brought a hunger to this community and Bavel. And then the rabbi said to Rav Yosef, the chief rabbi, Libae morachame, please pray for mercy to stop this famine. Amadu hashta umar Elisha dechi havu Rabbanan mipatere mikame havu paishe tere alfan umatan Rabbanan bedran ditcha lahava ba'e rachame ana ibae rachame. Rav Yosef basically says, how can I pray now? It's a time of divine anger, right? You could see from the famine that God is angry. I don't think it's going to help if I'm going to pray for mercy. And how does he know that this is not going to be useful activity? He says, look at Elisha. Elisha was so much greater than me. When Elisha would teach in public, he would have thousands of people, students would come to his shiurim. And when they left behind 2,200 sages that remained with Elisha. We're talking here about a kind of patronage system where the teacher not only taught students but also would take care of many of his students. They might live with him or nearby, and he would take care of their food and needs. And so there were two groups of students, like commuter students. They would come for the shiur, then go back home, and the students that actually lived under the teacher. So Elisha was so great that 2,200 were the ones that remained behind and that he directly took care of. And that's besides all the ones that were the commuter students. So he had a huge number of students, and yet when it was a time of anger, Elisha didn't pray. Me, I have many less students. I'm not as great as Elisha. So how can I pray? All right, that's the story. And now, how does he know? How did Rav Yosef here know that Elisha had 2,200 students that depended on him for their food? From the continuation of that pasuk that we just quoted, he says, here's 20 loaves. And his servant says, how can these 20 loaves feed 100 people? Now we ask, if you're talking about 20 loaves of bread for 100 people, well, that's a lot of food, especially during a time of famine. So every 5 people will share a loaf. All right, that's a significant amount of food. So what was he complaining about? Ela dechol chad vechad kameh me'aish. Rather, must be he meant that each loaf is going to have to feed 100 people. And altogether there were 20 loaves plus there was the 2 other items mentioned in the pasuk. So 22 of these things altogether, 22 loaves altogether, and each one is for 100 people. That's how we know that there were 2,200 students that were dependent on Elisha. Okay, good. Now that we mentioned this fact that he had so many students, we're going to mention other sages. When the sages would leave the school of Rav, they finished the shiur, and the commuter students would go back home. Same number as Elisha, 2,200 would remain. So this is Rav. The following list is going to actually be a really important list if you ever want to remember the generations of the various Amoraim. You should remember all the names in this story. These are great representatives of the top Amorah or couple of Amoraim in each generation in Bavel. So Rav is the first generation. He's the greatest. He had 2,200. Mibe Rav Huna. Rav Huna is the student of Rav. You always have say, right? Rav Huna said in the name of Rav. He had only 800 students that remained behind, so not as great as Rav, but still a significant number. Rav Huna vadaresh bitlesar Amorae ki havu kaime Rabanan memetivta de Rav Huna venafse gilimaihu havasalek abaka vechase leyoma. Rav Huna, in fact, had so many students in the lesson that he needed 13 public speakers. In those days, the rabbi would sit down and speak quietly. It wasn't it's considered honorable for the one person giving the lecture to have to scream. They didn't have microphones or anything, and so he would sit quietly. And he had a person with a loud voice who were themselves a student. A high-level student that would listen to what the rabbi had to say and then repeat it in a louder voice, sometimes elaborate on it also. There were so many people in Rav Huna's shiur that one was not enough. He needed 13, and they would relay to each other. One would say it, and the other one would hear it and say it to the next group that were farther away. This reminds me nowadays in some big colleges, there's these huge lectures with 1,000 students in it, and the professor needs 20 or 30 teaching assistants just to go and grade all the essays and have recitations with the students. So that's how many people there were. You need 13 of these human loudspeakers. And when they finished the session and the rabbis got up from the lecture, they would dust off their cloaks from after sitting for a while, and the dust cloud would rise up and block out the sun. That's how many people there were that you can have even see this big dust cloud and block it out, block out the sun. And even in the west, in Eretz Yisrael, they could see that dust cloud. That's how big it was. When they saw it, they would say, "Oh, I guess Rav Huna's shiur just finished. That's why there's all that dust, and it's blocking out the sunlight." Okay, fantastic. Now we go to the third generation, Rabba and Rav Yosef, and when they finished their shiur and the commuter students went home, there would be left 400 that would live with and were dependent on these two sages. And they called themselves orphans because compared to the previous generation, they were so few. And so when the sages would leave from the house or the school of Abaye, so Abaye now is already the fourth generation, and some say it's Rav Papa, he's the fifth generation, and some say we're talking about Rav Asher, he's in the sixth generation. Havu Paishu Matan Rabbanan. So whoever it is, there was only 200 sages that remained behind then. Vekarud Nafshaihu Yatmeh de Yatmeh, and they call themselves orphans of orphans because it was so few. So here's a Yeridat Hadorot, of fewer students as they went along. But once again, a good way to remember the generations. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Difa, Amar Rabbi Ameh, Mebakere Mumin Shebirushalayim Yonotlin Secharan Betrumat Halishka. Okay, now we go back to our subject. Since we mentioned that judges would get their salaries from the Bet HaMikdash, from the Machasit HaShekel, also the inspectors of blemishes, an animal brought for a korban has to be free of blemishes. You need an expert to come and check to make sure. And the person bringing the korban can't pay them, because then that would also be cloud their judgment. And so instead, they would be paid from the machasita shekel funds. The lishka is the chamber where the machasita shekel was collected. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shemuel, Talmidei Chachamim hamelamedim hilchot shechita lekohanim hayu notin secharan mitrumat halishka. Says the sages that would teach the laws of shechita to the kohanim, they would also get paid from Tirumat Halishka. This is really interesting that the Kohanim don't know it themselves. You need the rabbis to teach the Kohanim the right way to do it. So that's just a side point that's showing that the rabbis are the ones that are in charge, know the halacha, and the Kohanim, they're functionaries, they do it, right? But they are dependent on rabbinic knowledge. I think this is an expression of the shift of balance after the destruction of Beit HaMikdash, the religious leadership going from Kohanim to sages. Amar Rav Yigidel Amar Rav Talmidei Chachamim hamelamedim hilchot kemisa lakohanim notlin secharan mitrumat halishka. Not only regarding shechita, which actually was done outside the Beit HaMikdash too, but kemitza, when you have to pick up a handful of flour with 3 fingers worth of the flour, and then you even it out with the outer 2 fingers, the exact details of how to do that. Also, the rabbis would be teaching the Kohanim. Those teachers would collect their salary from Tirumat Halishka. Amar bar Hana Amar Rabbi Yochanan Magihe Sefarim Shebirushalayim Hayu Notlin Secharan Mitirumat Halishka. So Rabbi Yochanan adds that also the proofreaders of the Torah scrolls, the scribes that would go around and make sure that all of the holy scripture scrolls of scripture were correct and have mistakes, they were also paid for from Tirumat Halishka, from the Machasita Shekel funds. Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rav Nashim ha'orgot ba'parochet notelot secharan mitrumat halishka. The women who were weaving the curtains for the Bet HaMikdash, the parochet specifically, that would separate the Kodesh from Kodesh Kodashim. So women that worked on weaving that they also got their salary from the Tirumat Halishka. That is what Rav Nachman said in the name of Rav. Although Rav Nachman himself disagreed, I say that actually they should be paid from a different fund, Bedek Habayit. Bedek Habayit is money that would be donated for the building and upkeep of the Bet HaMikdash. If someone would donate, the worth of themselves, for example, that would normally go to the Bedek Habayit. So then, since that is for the structure and upkeep of the structure, so he says these curtains are part of the structure of the Bet HaMikdash, and therefore it should be it should be for Bedek Habayit funds and not Machasita Shekel funds. Machasita Shekel funds are mainly for public offerings like the Korban Tamid, and so other things that would go along with that. When there was surplus, the surplus was used for other things. So Rav Nachman says it's part of the building structure, and therefore should be used for that. Question. Me'etibeh. We have a challenge to Rav Nachman, who said we pay for the curtains from the building fund, Bedek Habayit. Look at this baraita, however. Nashim ha'orgot ba'parochet, bet garmu al ma'aseh lechem hapanim, bet abtinas al ma'aseh ketoret. Kulan hayu notlot secharan mitrumat halishka. So the following people all get their wages from Tirumat halishka, from Machasita Shekel. And the first item on the list includes women who were weaving the curtains. It also includes the people of Garmu, this family of Garmu. They were experts in making the lechem hapanim, the 12 loaves that were in a special shape, like this. So they knew the secret recipe of how to make those 12 loaves, and also the family that would make of Avtinas that knew how to make the ketoret. They knew the secret recipe of how to make the ketoret. They deserved to get a salary for their work, and they would all get it from the Machasita Shekel. So look, this baraita says that the women that were making the curtains would get it from Machasita Shekel, agreeing with Rav, and that is against Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman, how would you explain this baraita? And Rav Nachman could say, Hatam bid babe. That baraita is talking about not the curtain in the within the Bet HaMikdash, that separating the Kodesh and Kodashim, not the parochet, but rather the outer curtains of the gates. those were not part of the structure, and therefore would be would be paid for by Trumat Halishka, not by Bedek Habayit. As we see, there were lots of different gates. There were a lot of different curtains, 13 of them in the second Bet HaMikdash. 7 of the curtains were behind the 7 gates, these outer gates of the entrance gates. So those were all just for decorative purposes. Because you actually have a gate there. And therefore, those, because they were decorative, could not be paid for by the Bedek Habayit. That's the maintenance for the building itself, but rather those were for those were from Trumat Halishka. That's what the Braita was talking about. But the other gate, the other ones, the one that Rav Nachman was talking about was the parochet itself. That was essential. Part. And in fact, in the first Bet HaMikdash, there was a wall there. But the second Bet HaMikdash, it was too high. The ceiling was too high to have a physical wall, and that's why they used a curtain. But the curtain inside the Kodesh is, in fact, a structural part of it, and that's why he says it's Bedek Habayit. Okay, here are the other curtains. Echad lepitcho shel echad, v'echad lepitcho shel olam. One in the entrance to the sanctuary, one to the entrance hall. Shenayim b'devir, 2 within the partition. Shenayim kenegdan ba'aliyah. So within the Kodesh Kodashim area, and the above in the upper chamber also had 2 curtains, and so that's how we answer for Rav Nachman. Back to the list. Also, women who would raise their sons for Para Aduma, they would get their funding from Terumat Halishka, from Machasita Shekel. This is talking about that Para Aduma had to be prepared in Betahara. There was big machloket about the people that prepare the Para Aduma, whether they have to be 100% tahor or they could be a Tivul Yom, means that they touched sheretz or something during the day, went to the mikveh already, but the sun didn't set yet. The rabbis / Pharisees thought that was fine. The Sadducees said no. And so the rabbis went out of their way to get a kohen, make him tameh by touching a dead rodent, and then go to the mikveh and do the Para Aduma before sunset, just to show that it's permitted, and polemicize against the Sadducees. Because they allowed that leniency, they don't want people to take it too lightly, the whole Para Aduma, so therefore they added a whole stringency to it, and the stringency is that when they prepare it, they want to make sure that the person that goes and gathers the water for it will be for sure that he never became Tameh Met at all. So they have a mother, a pregnant woman, come and live in a courtyard on top of bedrock, and on the bedrock is a platform, so we're sure that there's no Tumat Met there. They would give birth to the child, raise the child within the courtyard their whole lives until they're like 7, 8 years old. And so we know for sure that this kid is not tameh, and then that kid would go and gather the water. Okay, all that as very interesting and part of Masechet Mishnah Masechet Para. But anyway, these women how are they going to fund raising these kids for Para Aduma from Terumat Halishka? Good. Abba Shaul omed, Nashim Yekarot sheBirushalayim hayu zanot otan umefanesot otan. Abba Shaul, however, says, no, it was not from the temple funds, but rather wealthy women in Jerusalem, they would feed and provide for the women who were raising their children to help to prepare the Para Aduma. So not from, I guess, they like to do that they get a hand in helping these other women, and thereby allowing for Para Aduma to be done properly. Okay, Ba'amineh Rav Huna Merav. A question Rav Huna asked his teacher Rav, Kile sharet mahu sheyasu mikoche bedek habayit, regarding the temple vessels, gold and silver vessels that were used as part of the korbanot and menachot. What source of funds can we take from in order to pay for these temple vessels? Here's the two sides. Sorech mizbeach ninhu mikoche bedek habayit atu. These vessels are they needed for the mizbeach? They actually are appurtenances. They serve the altar, and just like the mizbeach itself is a permanent fixed structure, and can be, and the temple maintenance funds are used for that, bedek habayit. So too, the vessels that go along with the mizbeach are also paid for by bedek habayit maintenance funds. That's one side. Or sorech korbanin hu mitrumat halishka yuosin otan. Or are these vessels needed for the sacrifices? And just like the sacrifices are paid for from machasita shekel, that's kept in this chamber, so too, these vessels that we need, that we're going to put the korbanot in the vessels, in the blood, collect the blood in the vessels. So therefore, they are appurtenances to the korbanot, and we pay for it from machasita shekel. That's the question. And so Rav answers, we only use mitrumat halishka funds. The vessels are connected with the korbanot. Okay, from machasita shekel. All right, Rav Huna says, wait a second, I have a challenge to that from this following pasuk in Divrei Yamim. Itibeh uchalotam hebiu lifnei hamelech v'yihoyada hakohen. The word hakohen is not in the original pasuk. Et she'ad ha'kesef v'ya'asehu kelim lebet Adonai kele sharet. In the time of Yehoyada, who was the Kohen. There were people that were working on the maintenance of the Bet HaMikdash, and they brought before the king and Yehoyada the rest, the leftover. They raised a certain amount of money for the maintenance, and they had surplus. It's never happened since that there's surplus of building funds. I've never heard that happen, but I guess in Bet HaMikdash, they had so much. So what did they do with the surplus? And so they used it for the temple vessels. So here you go. This is Bedek HaBayit funds for the maintenance of the Bet HaMikdash, and the surplus of it they actually did use for vessels. So this seems to support using Bedek HaBayit and not Terumat HaLishka funds, right? And Rav said, no, we only use Terumat HaLishka funds and not Bedek HaBayit funds. So how is he going to answer that? Amar le de akriyach ketubot la akriyach nevi'eh ach lo ye'aseh bet Adonai sipot v'gomer ki le'oseh melacha yitenuhu. So Rav tells his student Rav Huna, the one who taught you ketubim obviously did not teach you nevi'im, because here's another pasuk in Sefer Melachim that says, but there were not made for the house of God cups of vessels, sniffers, all these items, vessels of gold and silver, of the money that was brought in for Hashem, for they gave that to those who did the work. In other words, this money that they raised for maintenance was used to pay the workers and was not used for temple vessels. So you see, so Rav says, look, I have a pasuk from Nevi'im that's better than your pasuk in Ketuvim. All right, now that we have these two pasukim, we ask, these two verses themselves seem to contradict each other. How are we going to, before we solve the problem of what the rabbis say, these two pesukim have to be resolved. Lakasha, kan shekavu vehotiru, kan shegavu velo hotiru. Okay, that depends on if there was extra. If they collected and there was extra funds, that is a pasuk here in Ketubim, she'ad hakesef, so there was a little extra left over. In that case, you can use Bedek HaBayit funds. If there's extra, you can use it for vessels. Whereas the pasuk in Melachim said, no, there was not extra in that case. And that's why they had to make sure to give all of the money to the workers, because it was raised for maintenance, has to be used for maintenance. And one could not use it for anything else. So that's how we can resolve the two pesukim. Now we ask, wait a second, even if there is extra, if they collected the money for the purpose of the temple maintenance, how could they go ahead and use it for something else? Amar Rabbi Abhu, leb betin matne alehen imusrechu srechu ve'im lav yehu lichle sharet. So Rabbi Abhu explains that betin, even if they don't say it explicitly, it's implied that there's an implied condition that if, look, we're going to collect this money, if it's needed for the maintenance, we're going to use it all for the maintenance, not for anything else. But if not, if there is extra, then we can use it for temple vessels. Okay, good. So we have the pesukim can be, in fact, be coordinated with each other. Now we have another baraita on this very subject. Tana debe Rabbi Ishmael kele sharet ba'in mitrumat halishka. So this would support Rav, who says that the Rabbi Ishmael is is Rabbi Ishmael's opinion is supporting Rav that temple vessels can come from the machasita shekel. And as you know, shenemad et she'ar hakesef ezu kesef sheyesh lo shiraim heve omer ze trumat halishka. And interestingly, he's using this very pasuk that was used here before to challenge Rav, right? This is the pasuk from the Ramim that Rav Huna used to challenge Rav, because was talking about Bedek Habayit, is actually used as a proof now for Rav and for Rabbi Ishmael that says Trumat Halishka. How are they proving that? Even though the context of the pasuk is talking about maintenance, but the word she'ar hakesef, the surplus funds, what does it mean? Where do we find money that has a surplus? That is the machasita shekel funds. Why? Because machasita shekel, you have to collect it every Nisan. Whatever you collect, you have to use that year. Once Rosh Chodesh Nisan comes, all the money of the previous year cannot be used any longer for buying korban sibur. So all of that is going to necessarily be surplus. So when it says shara kesef, it must be talking about machasita shekel, because that's what necessarily has a surplus. Unlike building funds, where usually it's not going to have a surplus. So that's why Rabbi Ishmael actually proves from this very pasuk that we use machasita shekel funds for the temple vessels, and that this now we know how Rav would explain both of those pesukim. Okay. Now we ask, hold on, how do you know we're talking about the machasita shekel funds and the machasita shekel funds themselves, trumat halishka, that which we take out, which we collect from that chamber? Maybe it's talking about only the leftovers. So now we're distinguishing between when people gave the machasita shekel funds, they were put in the chamber. Now, every so often, they would bring baskets and fill up the baskets with machasita shekel funds and use that and take it out. So there's machasita shekel that's actually designated for korbanot, and then there's the leftover that's still left in the chamber that was never removed. So Rabbi Ishmael sounds like he was talking about trumat halishka, that which was drawn out in the baskets that they didn't use for korbanot. We had some extra, so he says we use that for the temple vessels. But now we're asking, maybe it's talking about the machasita shekel funds in the chamber that were never put in baskets, but just remained in the chamber. So why don't you say that? And the answer is kedamarava ha'ola ola rishona hachinami hakesef kesef rishon. We're not going to say that, even though it says she'ar hakesef, which does sound like the surplus. Sounds like it's what's left over in the chamber, but not so because of the ha'yidiyah here. Just like Rava said regarding ha'ola, and it doesn't say which ola it is. He says the ola. That means that the korban tamid is referring to korban tamid. Why does it say ha'ola? To say that it is first. The korban tamid always has to be the first during the day. So too, ha-kesef is talking about the first kesef, meaning the money that is removed from the chamber first. That will be used for the vessels. So in fact, it is talking about there's two different surpluses. The surplus that's in the baskets that we didn't use for korbanot, and not the surplus that is left in the chamber. Okay, so that is the opinion of Rabbi Ishmael. And now Rabbi Ishmael and Rav have their support, and we understand temple vessels are used from machasita shekel funds that were surplus in the basket. Me'etibeh. Challenge to this. Haketoret v'chol korbanot tzibur ba'in mitrumat halishka. Mizbach hazahav ulbonach lesharet ba'in mimotar nesachim. Okay, Braita is going to go on, but let's explain first. To paying for the ketoret and all korbanot tzibur, all public sacrifices like korban tamid. From that we use that which we draw from machazita shekel, drawn from the chamber in the baskets. Whereas the golden ark, right, that's Mizbach HaKetoret, is interestingly not attached to the ground, so it's not considered part of the structure of the Bet HaMikdash, and you don't pay for it from Bedek Habayit, but rather what we're going to see as follows. So Mizbach HaZahav, and also the Livona, the frankincense that was put together with the 12 loaves, on the shulchan, and also temple vessels. That's what we need. All are coming from another source we haven't discussed yet. not bedek habayit, not machazit shekel, but rather extra money that was used to buy nesachim ingredients like flour, oil, wine. Anything left over from that flour would be used for these purposes. So now we see kles sharet were actually paid for by the extra flour, extra nesachim. So this is going to be a challenge to what Rabbi Yishmael above. But we go on also and say mizbach ha'olah l'shakot v'azarot ba'in memikdeshe bedek habayit. So to upkeep the mizbeach, the large mizbeach outdoors for korbanot, and also the chambers and the various courtyards, upkeeping those, that's bedek habayit, the upkeep maintenance fund. Chutz lechomat ha'azara ba'in mishiyareh ha'leshachot, but the outer wall of the Bet HaMikdash, not itself part of the Bet HaMikdash, that comes from what remains in the chamber, in the Machazit HaShekel chamber, is used for the outer walls. זוהי ששנינו חומת העיר ומגדלותיה וכל צורכי העיר באים משערי הלשכה, and this supports that which we learned, that the wall of the city of Jerusalem and its towers and all the other things that are necessary in the city of Jerusalem also would be paid for from the remainder of Machazit HaShekel that was still left in the chamber and not taken out in the baskets. Okay, so now we have a contradiction. Are we going to use for the vessels? Are we going to use the Machazit HaShekel? Or are we going to use the nesachim, the extra flour? Tana'ehi, it's a machloket Tana'im, in fact. And here's a Mishnah in Masechet Shekalim that's going to bring several opinions. Ditanan. Motat teruma mehayu osin ba. What do we do with the extra machazit shekel? Riku ezahab sipui lebet kodesh kodeshim. The first opinion is that we use it for gold plating of the walls and floors of the kodesh kodeshim. Okay, we beautify it even though hardly anyone can see it. Rabbi Yishmael, that's Tanakama. Rabbi Yishmael omer motar perot leches hamizbeach, motar teruma lechle hasharet. Rabbi Yishmael, that's the same opinion as we saw in the Braita above, who also agrees with Rav, says that the extra produce, we're going to see what that is in a minute, so hold on to that, but the extra funds from the sale of produce was used for ketz mizbeach, means the dessert on the mizbeach. Whenever the mizbeach was idle, there was no one bring korbanot, we didn't want to sit there idly, so we would go and bring extra korbanot to keep the mizbeach busy and beautify it. And here it is, motar tiruma, the extra machazit shekel, that goes to temple vessels. So that's Rabbi Yishmael's opinion as above, and that's mentioned in this Mishnah as well. Rabbi Akiva, however, omer motar tiruma leches mizbeach, motar nesachim lechle sharet. The extra machazit shekel funds, that's what we use for added korbanot, for the dessert korbanot while it's idle, and the extra flour that for libations, that is used for temple vessels. So we see that the Braita that we cited here to challenge Rabbi Yishmael is in fact the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. So that's how we explain the difference between those two Baraitot above. One is Rabbi Yishmael, one is Rabbi Akiva. Another opinion, Rabbi Chanina Segan HaKohanim omer, motar nesachim lekes hamizbeach, motar teruma lechle sharet. He switches around the two of Rabbi Akiva, and he says, in fact, that the extra flour is for the dessert of the mizbeach, whereas the extra machazit shekel, that goes to the temple vessels. So in this regard, he agrees with regarding the vessels, he agrees with Rabbi Yishmael. Okay, veze lo hayu modim beperot, but both Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chanina Segan HaKohanim disagree with Rabbi Yishmael regarding the produce. All right, let's see what the produce is. Perot maihi. דתניא, מותר תרומה מהיו עושים בה, לוקחים פירות בזול ומוכרים אותם ביוקר, והשכר מקייסין בו את המזבח, וזוהי ששנינו מותר פירות לכס המזבח. So in this Braita it explains that the extra machazit shekel funds, what would they do with it? They would buy produce at a cheap price, and then they would sell it at an expensive price. So in other words, the Bet HaMikdash was able to invest it and buy low, sell high, and then with the profit that they made, they would buy extra korbanot for the dessert of the mizbeach, and that's why, it says above, the extra from perot would go to the dessert of the mizbeach. That was the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael right here. That's what Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chanina Segan Kohanim both disagree with Rabbi Ishmael, and they think that you do not do the perot. You do not sell the perot. Okay, now why does it say that they both disagree? Here's the source of it in the Mishnah. Titnan motash yadei lishka mehayosin ba lochin behen yenot shemanim uslatot v'asachar lehekdesh divrei Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Akiva omer en mishtakerin beshel hekdesh af lo beshel aniyim. So here in this Mishnah, we see explicitly the machloket regarding the produce, that according to Rabbi Ishmael, the extra funds that were in the chamber, they would buy with it wine and oil and flour. And and then that people that the Bet HaMikdash could sell that for a profit to people that would come and they wanted to make korban mincha. And the profit would go to Hekdesh for other uses. That is the opinion of Rabbi Ishmael. But Rabbi Akiva says, no, we do not benefit. The Bet HaMikdash does not profit from something that is consecrated property, and also property funds that were collected for the poor, we do not invest and make a profit on. Here we see the reasoning of Rabbi Akiva, that he does not want to benefit. He does not think it's permitted to benefit to invest and gain a profit from these items that were all donated items. Let's see the reasoning for Rabbi Akiva. Because there is no poverty in a place of wealth. In other words, Bet HaMikdash is a place of wealth, and if you have to take a little and make it go for a long time, then that's why you invest. I have a little money, but I really need to buy something expensive. You know what? I'm going to invest it, and maybe I'll make a profit, and with the profit I could buy something. But if someone is super wealthy, then they don't need to invest. And so the Bet HaMikdash, we don't want it to there to be an aura of it's that they're impoverished. Oh, look, they need to go and make investments to make more money. And so that's why it's not honorable for the Bet HaMikdash funds. And how come we don't invest money that was collected to give to the poor? Because maybe a person will come to ask for money because they need help, and then we're not going to have anything to give them because it's all invested in some business. Rather, the communal funds for the poor have to be liquid, so that anytime a poor person comes, they will be available for them to take. And so that is the reason behind the machloket between Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.